The courtroom buzzed with the usual low murmur, lawyers shuffling papers, clerks typing rapidly, and a pair of officers leaning casually against the back wall. A black man, dressed in a plain gray suit, sat quietly at the defense table, his expression unreadable, his hands folded neatly in front of him. Deputy Coleman elbowed his partner, Officer Reese, whispering just loud enough to be heard by a few in the vicinity. "Guy looks like he got lost on his way to traffic court," he snorted, eyeing the man's calm demeanor. "Bet he thinks the suit makes him look important." Reese chuckled. "Yeah. Some folks think dressing up changes the story. We'll see how tough he is once the judge starts grilling him." They weren't exactly hiding their amusement. Every time the defendant adjusted his tie or glanced at a file, the officers exchanged glances, smirks creeping across their faces. What they didn't know, what most of the room didn't yet realize, was that this man was not the defendant. He was Director Nathaniel Cross, the recently appointed head of the FBI. And he was here for a reason. Director Nathaniel Cross remained composed, allowing the chatter to echo behind him like distant static. He was used to it. Being underestimated wasn't new, in fact, he had built an entire career on turning silent assumptions into loud corrections. Judge Mallory entered, her gavel striking the sound block with a sharp crack. "Court is now in session," she announced, scanning the courtroom. "We are convened today for a federal oversight review concerning conduct in the 86th Precinct." Whispers rippled through the benches. Oversight reviews were rare and serious. Officers Coleman and Reese straightened their postures, suddenly attentive, but still unaware of the man they had just mocked. From the gallery, a federal marshal stepped forward and spoke with the judge quietly. She nodded, then turned to the room. "Please rise for Director Nathaniel Cross, who will be leading today's federal assessment," she said. The man in the gray suit stood and walked confidently toward the front. His steps were measured but firm, his gaze now cool and direct. The courtroom shifted in stunned silence. Officer Reese blinked twice, his smirk vanishing. That's the FBI guy," he muttered. Coleman's throat tightened. "That can't be." He was sitting at the defense table. "He chose to sit there," came a voice from the prosecutor's side. "On purpose." Director Cross turned to face the room. "Thank you, Judge Mallory," he began, his voice calm, powerful. "Before we discuss the systemic concerns under review today, I wanted to observe this room as quietly as possible. I wanted to see how those under investigation conduct themselves when they believe no one's watching, or judging." His eyes landed, unmistakably, on the two officers in the back. They went pale. Cross continued. "And I've seen enough to begin." Director Cross stood at the podium, his posture the embodiment of quiet control, not the kind that seeks to dominate, but the kind that commands through certainty. The courtroom, only moments earlier filled with murmurs and casual indifference, now held its breath. "I didn't come here to put on a show," Cross began. "I came here because the citizens of this country deserve to know who they're entrusting with authority, and whether that trust is being honored or exploited." He turned a page in the folder he had carried in with him. A heavy silence blanketed the room. "During the past 6 months, we've received 43 separate internal complaints related to the 86th Precinct. Some minor. Others deeply concerning. But what's more alarming is the attitude behind the behavior. A mindset, not of service, but of judgment. Not of humility, but of mockery." Cross's eyes lifted toward the back of the room again. Officers Coleman and Reese, now sitting upright, no longer looked amused. Reese had begun to sweat noticeably, Coleman's jaw had clenched tight enough to make the muscle twitch along his cheek. "You may think what you said earlier was harmless," Cross said, directing his words without needing to name names. "A few comments. A little snickering. But that is exactly how deeper problems begin, in moments where professionalism is replaced by prejudice dressed up as humor." Someone shifted in the front row, a journalist from the Herald, scribbling furiously into a notepad. They had come for a dry oversight hearing, but this was turning into something else entirely. Judge Mallory leaned slightly forward, intrigued. "Director, are you saying you intentionally placed yourself at the defense table to provoke a reaction?" Cross nodded slowly. "Yes. I requested to sit there. Not as a trick. As a test." He paused just long enough to let the room feel the weight of that decision. "I've walked into rooms like this my whole life. Watched as assumptions bloomed the second I entered. I used to take it personally. Now, I take notes." A few audible exhales slipped out from the gallery, disbelief, discomfort, perhaps even admiration. Cross took a deep breath and returned his focus to the files in front of him. "I will now present a selection of audio recordings, transcripts, and personnel reviews from within this precinct, including instances where individuals sworn to uphold dignity and law allowed their personal assumptions to override that oath." He looked up one last time before continuing. "Because this isn't just about two officers and a courtroom moment. It's about a culture that's quietly excused too much for too long. And that ends now." The air was thick with consequence. And it was only the beginning. The courtroom had settled into a tense silence, but it wasn't passive. It pulsed, like the hush before a storm. Director Cross remained calm at the front, unfolding documents with the precision of someone who knew exactly how far the ripples would spread. He held up a single-page printout. "This is an internal log entry from Officer Reese, dated February 3rd. It references a traffic stop involving a young man headed home from his late shift at a hospital." Cross read aloud. Individual appeared agitated and evasive. Probably trying to avoid something. Said he was a nursing assistant, didn't seem the type. He paused. "Didn't seem the type," he repeated. "What exactly does that mean?" Neither Reese nor Coleman answered. Reese stared at the floor. Cross placed the document on the desk and reached for the next. "This one's from body cam footage, reviewed in connection with an unrelated incident. Officer Coleman joking with colleagues about a woman filing a complaint, saying, quote, 'She's just trying to play the sympathy card. That type always does.' The words lingered like smoke in the air, unwelcome and unforgotten. "I know what some of you may be thinking," Cross said, turning from the documents and looking directly at the jury box, though there was no trial, only observers. "You're wondering if these are isolated. If they're just two officers caught at bad moments. I wish that were the case." He walked to the screen that had been lowered behind him and clicked a remote. A series of names and timestamps filled the display, dozens of them. "These are just a fraction of the statements, logs, and encounters reviewed from this precinct over the past year. Dismissive language. Selective enforcement. Targeted citations. Humiliation under the guise of standard procedure. All patterns. All documented." He clicked again. A photo appeared, of a young boy, barely 16, sitting in the back of a patrol car. Face frightened. Wrists cuffed. He was stopped walking home from school. No record. No incident. He was held for questioning based on suspicion of acting nervous. No charges were filed. But he missed his tutoring session and was too embarrassed to explain why. He never went back. A hand went up in the gallery, a woman with tear-streaked cheeks. She said nothing. She didn't have to. Cross softened his tone but not his message. "This is the cost. It's not in headlines or crime reports. It's in the silent erosion of trust, of dignity. The kind you don't measure in data, you measure in lost potential, and quiet rage." He stepped away from the podium for a moment and folded his hands in front of him. "I didn't come here to accuse. I came here to expose. To remind everyone in this room that wearing a badge isn't just about power, it's about restraint. It's about responsibility. And above all, it's about respect." The judge watched him with a kind of solemn recognition. She hadn't known how important today's hearing would become. Neither had the press, but now every reporter in the room had their phones out, recording. And in the far corner, Officer Reese finally spoke. Barely a whisper, but loud enough to be heard, "We didn't know who you were." Cross turned to him, expression unmoved. "No. You didn't," he said. "But that's not the point. The problem is, you treated me like that because you thought I was no one." The silence that followed Director Cross's final words felt heavier than anything spoken. For a moment, even the judge didn't speak. The entire room was wrapped in the rawness of the truth just delivered, not as a performance, but as a reckoning. Officer Reese looked like he wanted to disappear. Coleman leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his badge glinting dully under the courtroom lights. But neither of them said a word. Cross returned to the center of the room. "This isn't about public shaming," he said firmly, as if sensing where people's minds were going. "I'm not here to ruin reputations for the sake of it. I'm here because the communities we serve no longer believe that uniforms automatically equal justice. And the worst part? Many of them have good reasons to feel that way." He reached into his folder again and retrieved a photograph, this time, of himself. A much younger Cross, dressed in plain clothes, hands cuffed behind his back, sitting on a curb. This was me. Age 23. Graduate student. Detained outside my own apartment for loitering. I had groceries in my hands. Gasps flickered across the gallery. "I never filed a complaint," Cross continued. "Because I thought it would go nowhere. I thought, it's not worth it. That night, I made a decision, if I couldn't make them see me, I would rise so high they couldn't ignore me." He looked directly at the officers. "And now here we are." Cross's voice remained steady, but there was a trace of emotion beneath the surface, not anger, not sorrow. Just truth worn with time. Judge Mallory finally spoke. "Director Cross," she said, her voice measured, "given the severity of these revelations, what steps do you recommend this court and Federal Review Board take?" Cross nodded. "First, I'm recommending a full internal audit of the 86th Precinct, immediate and comprehensive. Second, I'm assigning a federal oversight liaison to monitor all traffic stops and detainment protocols for a minimum of 6 months." Coleman shifted uncomfortably. "Third," Cross continued, "I'm requesting mandatory retraining for all field officers in the district, centered not just on compliance, but on psychological impact. Because procedure without empathy is nothing more than mechanical control." He let the words hang. "And lastly, I'll be submitting a personal letter to the mayor's office asking that promotions and assignments within this department be frozen until a full evaluation of officer conduct history is completed." Someone in the press row murmured, "That's going to blow the roof off." And yet Cross didn't look like a man wielding vengeance. He looked like a man fulfilling a promise, to that 23-year-old version of himself, and to every silent victim since. He turned back to the courtroom. "You thought I was on trial today. You thought this suit was a disguise," he said quietly. "But the real disguise, is how many of you have worn your badges." The impact landed. Judge Mallory nodded solemnly. "Request acknowledged. Measures will be taken immediately." As murmurs swelled again throughout the room, this time filled with a different energy, Cross stepped back from the podium. He had said what needed to be said. But the consequences, they were only beginning to take shape. The courtroom recessed within the hour, but no one rushed for the exit. There was a kind of dazed stillness among the attendees, as if they had all witnessed something tectonic shift beneath their feet and were still waiting for the aftershocks to stop. Director Cross walked quietly through the courthouse hallway, flanked by 2 federal agents. The reporters, now emboldened by the weight of the hearing, swarmed behind the security line, microphones extended, cameras flashing like lightning strikes in a slow-moving storm. Director Cross. Was today's hearing a setup? Did you know those officers personally? Are more precincts under review? He paused briefly, not to evade, but to clarify. "I'm not targeting anyone," he said, looking straight into the cameras. But I am targeting behavior. If anyone's afraid of accountability, they shouldn't be wearing the badge. Then he disappeared into the elevator, leaving the media to wrestle with the scope of what had just begun. Inside the 86th precinct, the atmosphere was grim. Lieutenant Ramirez stood in the briefing room, the morning's events already spiraling through every screen and phone in the building. A news anchor recapped it on loop. FBI director exposes officers in stunning courtroom reversal. You treated me that way because you thought I was no one. The words cut sharper every time they were replayed. Ramirez eyed officers Reese and Coleman, who now sat at the back, not smirking, silent. Their confidence from earlier had evaporated. They were no longer just subjects of internal chatter. They were part of a national story. You embarrassed this department, Ramirez said, pacing. Not because someone powerful was watching, but because you forgot what this job is supposed to be. Neither officer spoke. Reese's jaw twitched, like he wanted to justify himself but knew better. Ramirez looked at the others in the room. Let this be your warning. Everyone in this building is under the same microscope now. Every word. Every action. The room nodded in grim unison. Later that night, Director Cross sat alone in his office at FBI headquarters. The city lights glittered far beyond the window, artificial stars over a restless city. He removed the tie he had worn during the hearing and folded it carefully. It had belonged to his father, a man who had once walked the same streets but never climbed the walls that Cross had broken through. He looked over at a framed photograph on his desk. A much younger version of himself beside a weathered mentor, smiling. Back then, Cross had still believed that professionalism alone would be enough, that by working twice as hard, he could be treated the same. Now, he knew better. Not cynical. Just clear-eyed. There was a knock on his door. His assistant peeked in. Sir, your 7 a.m. with the Justice Department is confirmed. And, we've received 27 interview requests in the last 2 hours. Cross exhaled. Let them wait. He stood, stared once more out the window, and whispered to no one, let them all see now. Because what had started as a quiet test in a courtroom was quickly becoming a movement. And Director Nathaniel Cross wasn't going to stop here. By sunrise, the headlines stretched across every major outlet like a siren wailing through morning traffic. FBI director exposes officers in bold courtroom move. He wasn't the defendant, he was the one holding the mirror. You thought I was no one, Cross turned system on its head. Cable news anchors couldn't get enough. Social media lit up with clips of Director Cross's speech, edited into reels, montages, even TikToks with quotes overlaying moody instrumentals. The phrase, you treated me like that because you thought I was no one, trended for hours, not as a meme, but as a wake-up call. In classrooms and coffee shops, the discussion shifted. In law schools, professors rewrote lecture notes overnight. And in police departments across the country, command staff held emergency meetings, sensing the pressure building. At a town hall in Minneapolis, a retired officer stood up during a community QA session. I served for 30 years, he said, voice gravelly with age. I've made mistakes. But what Cross did, that wasn't theater. That was the kind of accountability we should have been demanding years ago. Meanwhile, in Washington, politicians scrambled to catch up. Some praised Cross's leadership, others criticized the method but couldn't ignore the message. In a press conference on Capitol Hill, a senator from Illinois addressed the cameras directly. This wasn't just a moment, she said. It was a mirror. And if departments across the country don't like what they see in it, then maybe they've been looking away too long. Back in the 86th precinct, the consequences continued to unfold. Internal affairs had arrived before noon, folders in hand. Officers Coleman and Reese were placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Neither spoke to reporters camped outside the precinct entrance. But something had changed inside the building. You could feel it in the way officers carried themselves, more careful, more measured. For some, it was discomfort. For others, a strange sense of relief. The kind that comes when someone finally says out loud what's been whispered for years. In a quiet neighborhood outside the city, an older woman watched the news coverage in her living room. She turned to her grandson, a teenager who had been stopped once for biking too fast on the sidewalk and had never forgotten how that felt. "That man, the one in the suit," she said. He nodded. "He's why you keep going," she whispered. "You don't let what they think define what you are." Director Cross sat in a secure conference room at FBI headquarters, fielding calls from the Department of Justice, civil rights attorneys, and even a few police chiefs who wanted to implement immediate reforms. But his mind kept drifting back, not to the courtroom, but to the young man in the photo. 16 years old. Cuffed. Scared. Alone. He wasn't just reviewing precincts anymore. He was fighting for him. For all of them. And for the first time in a long time, he felt the system shifting beneath his feet, not against him, but maybe, just maybe, because of him. Weeks passed, but the momentum never slowed. At the heart of the FBI headquarters, Director Cross convened a special task force made up of federal agents, civil rights advocates, community leaders, and law enforcement reform experts. The goal was clear: rebuild trust by reshaping policies, not just on paper, but in practice. The 86th Precinct became a pilot site for innovative programs emphasizing transparency, empathy, and community partnership. Officers participated in workshops on implicit bias, de-escalation, and restorative justice. Cameras and citizen review panels became the new normal. Meanwhile, the national conversation grew richer and more nuanced. It wasn't just about bad actors anymore. It was about the system itself, how culture, training, and accountability intersected to shape every interaction. One afternoon, Director Cross stood before a packed auditorium at a national law enforcement conference. The room was filled with officers, policymakers, journalists, and young people eager to listen. He looked out over the crowd, remembering the young man who once sat cuffed and frightened. "Today," Cross said, "we take responsibility, not only for our mistakes but for the culture that allowed those mistakes to fester." He paused, voice steady. "It's not about punishment. It's about progress. About creating an environment where every person, regardless of who they are or where they come from, can walk into a courtroom or down a street and be seen, truly seen, for their humanity." The room erupted into applause. Back in the 86th Precinct, Officer Reese met with community members in a local church basement. He listened, really listened, as residents shared their experiences and concerns. It was the first step toward rebuilding trust, a step he had once mocked but now embraced. And somewhere, in a quiet moment after a long day, Director Cross reflected on the journey. He knew the fight was far from over. But the walls had begun to crack, and through those cracks, light was finally breaking in. He smiled softly, thinking of the line that had changed everything: "You treated me like that because you thought I was no one. No longer. Because now, everyone was someone." And that was only the beginning. The courtroom, once a place of quiet judgment, had become a symbol of change, a turning point where silence was broken, and truth began to rise. Director Nathaniel Cross stood at the threshold of his office, looking out over the city skyline one last time before stepping into the future he was determined to build. He understood now more than ever, real leadership wasn't about wielding power or delivering verdicts. It was about inspiring accountability, fostering respect, and bridging divides that had been allowed to grow for far too long. The story that began with whispered mockery and hidden assumptions had become a movement, a call to action echoing across precincts, classrooms, and living rooms nationwide. And though the road ahead was long, every step taken from this day forward was a step toward justice redefined. Cross took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and walked forward. Because when those sworn to protect see every person as worthy, not as no one, the true work of justice begins. And that work would never end.